The morning sun cast a pale golden sheen across the sleepy village of Chipping Woodleigh, and spring had dressed the hedgerows in their softest green. In the gardens of Lavender End, celandines had burst into bloom. Small yellow stars nestled among fresh grass and mossed stone, dotting the paths like a fairy's breadcrumbs. It was the sort of day that made people pause over their teacups and sigh contentedly that all was well with the world. Miss Marple, however, never sighed contentedly without suspicion. She had just settled into her usual wicker chair on the back terrace of her own little cottage, Rosemead, with a cup of hot water and a rather dull sock in progress, when the village peace was disturbed, not by anything so violent as a scream or gunshot, but by the peculiar arrival of Gertie Lockwood. Gertie, who had kept the gardens at Lavender End since she was 16, was a woman of stout constitution and few words, never given to hysterics or half-done jobs. That was why it was so notable that she came hobbling down the lane like a woman 3 times her age, face drained of color, hands shaking, her battered gardening gloves still on. She didn't come to the police station. She didn't go home. She came directly to Miss Marple. "I beg your pardon, miss," Gertie whispered as she reached the gate, "but there's someone lying face down in the celandines, at the edge of the lower orchard, and I think they're quite dead." Miss Marple set down her teacup, picked up her shawl, and rose without a word. There was no urgency in her step. Miss Marple never rushed, but a steadiness, a settling of shoulders, as if she were turning a page in a well-worn book she'd read before, in another village, under different names. They reached the grounds of Lavender End within a few minutes. Gertie led the way, still murmuring fragments, not supposed to be there. "Mr. Templeton don't use that part, not since the foxglove got out of hand. The house itself, Lavender End, sat with regal defiance on its modest hill, ivy crawling up its grey stone bones, windows peering down like sleepy but judgmental eyes. It had once been a home of repute, a minor manor passed down through the Templeton family since before the Great War, though now only Mr. Basil Templeton remained, a bachelor of vague income and increasingly vague habits. Down the slope, past the formal lawn and half-wild rose arbor, they reached the low wall that separated the gardens from what had once been an orchard, but now was little more than bramble and memory. There, among the celandines and leaning wild cherry trees, lay the figure, a man, it seemed, in a grey suit that had not aged gracefully. His arms were flung at awkward angles, and one hand clutched a tuft of grass as though trying to rise or anchor himself. His hat, a narrow-brimmed thing more suited to a solicitor than a farmer, lay a few feet away. There was no blood, no sign of violence that could be seen from above. Miss Marple leaned over gently, peering at the face, now half-turned and still. "I don't believe I know him," she said quietly. "Do you, Gertie?" "No, miss," Gertie murmured. "But there's a queer sort of paper in his pocket." "I didn't touch it." They waited. Then, Gertie pale and wide-eyed, Miss Marple serene and still, like to women waiting for the kettle to boil, until the constable arrived. Young P.C. Larch, Cool's mustache gave him a seriousness his eyes did not yet possess. Puffed up the hill and down the path with a notepad flapping in one hand. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Found him? Did you? No, Gertie did, she replied mildly. I merely arrived to confirm what she feared. And what's that? Then Miss Marple looked down once more at the stranger in the flowers and said, that a man one knows has died in a garden few use, and in spring, when everything else is just beginning. P.C. Larch swallowed, nudged his cap, and bent to examine the body. Miss Marple turned back toward the lane, her eyes scanning the rose arbor, the shuttered windows of Lavender End, the faint trail of a fox or child or thief that might have crept through the weeds unnoticed. She did not know yet what had happened, but she knew, with the quiet certainty of one who had seen too much and listened too well, that the Celandines would not be the only things blooming this spring. There would be secrets. There always were. The man was identified before nightfall, not by Gertie, not by the police, and certainly not by Miss Marple, though she had her suspicions early on. No, it was Basil Templeton himself, emerging from the shadows of Lavender End with the reluctant gait of a man summoned to unpleasant duty. He stood beside the body in his old brown tweed, hands clasped behind his back, like a professor inspecting an underperforming student, and said rather curtly, that, I believe, is Mr. O'Merrick Rowe. He was here for lunch. This came as a surprise to nearly everyone, especially Gertie, who had not prepared anything more than cold tongue and a pot of tea for one. But Basil, looking almost affronted by the reaction, clarified. He wasn't an announced guest. He arrived late in the morning, just before I went out to meet with the vicar about the Historical Society's donations. I asked him to wait in the garden, and he didn't come in afterward, sir? Asked P.C. Larch, scribbling awkwardly in his notebook. No, said Basil, narrowing his eyes, and I thought nothing of it until I saw your constable approaching from the drive. I assumed he'd grown bored and wandered off. That would have been rather like him. It was, Miss Marple thought silently, a strange way to speak of a man who had turned up dead in your orchard. Then again, Basil Templeton was a strange sort of man. Rowe, as it turned out, had not been entirely a stranger to the village, though few had noticed him. A solicitor from Bath, unmarried, early 60s, with the kind of neat beard and blue velvet waistcoat that suggested both money and loneliness. He had come to Lavender End once before, a few months prior, for tea and estate matters, no doubt. There had been whispers, afterward, of papers and signatures. No one had asked too closely what they concerned. By the following morning, the village was seething. Dropped dead in the flowers. He did, said Mr. Cramley, the butcher, to anyone who came in for sausages. I always said that orchard was cursed, muttered old Mrs. Hannaford, who once claimed her cat had vanished near there. Poison, claimed Tilly from the post office, her eyes wide as she handed out envelopes. He looked too peaceful for a stroke. Meanwhile, the doctor had arrived and gone, his expression neutral and his pronouncement vague. Cardiac arrest, likely. No visible trauma. But the coroner will know more. P.C. Larch. uncomfortable in the face of so many theories, simply cordoned off the area and told everyone to mind their business until the inspector from Melchester arrived. Miss Marple, for her part, made no declarations, but her knitting grew slower, her glances longer, and her walks around the village became more frequent, particularly down the narrow lane behind the churchyard, where no one but dogs and ghosts went. She saw and remembered much by the time Inspector Denham arrived that evening. A square-faced man with a fondness for pipes and disdain for gossip. The rumors had outpaced the facts tenfold. He was found lying face down. Denham repeated when briefed. "Yes, sir." Larch nodded. No signs of struggle. Hat nearby. No bruises. Wallet untouched. Denham glanced at Basil Templeton, who had offered a lukewarm pot of tea and a single digestive biscuit, and asked, "And you left the man alone in your garden, with no idea why he'd come?" He mentioned business. Basil replied stiffly, "Legal papers." I assumed it was following up from a previous consultation. He was a somewhat tedious man, and I did not particularly care to entertain him. I asked Gertie to keep him company. Gertie blinked. He never spoke to me, sir. Just walked out to the orchard, like he knew the way. And when did you last see him alive? Just before E11's, sir. I passed him sitting on the old stone bench. He had a book open, but he weren't reading it, just staring at the roses. Miss Marple, standing near the hallway bookshelf, paused mid-reach for a gardening pamphlet. Roses, she thought. Always the roses at Lavender End. Denham continued his questions, methodical and dispassionate. No signs of break-in, no missing items, no bruises, scratches, or bleeding. And yet the man, perfectly healthy by all accounts, was dead. Natural causes, the doctor had said again, but not confidently, to natural, murmured Miss Marple under her breath, as she stared out the window toward the rose arbor. It was too soon to say, but something about the entire affair reminded her of poor Timothy Marchbanks, and the laudanum-laced lemon tart in Dorking. Or perhaps it was more like Eleanor Pollitt and the mysteriously misplaced love letters. Different details, but the same quiet rot beneath the rhododendrons, and the same certainty that the dead never place themselves. Nor do secrets stay buried long when the garden starts talking. Miss Marple turned back toward her shawl and cup of water, her mind quietly blooming like the celandines by the orchard wall. Whatever had killed old Merrickrow, it was not nature, not. In Chipping Woodleigh. By the following Thursday, Chipping Woodleigh had become a village of amateur detectives. From the red telephone box by the vicarage to the stone benches outside the grocer's, conversation had only one theme: the strange death of Mr. Almeric Rowe Mrs. Partridge, the retired schoolmistress with a flair for dramatic pauses, made a habit of stopping her morning walk precisely at the church-like gate, to repeat, always in hushed tones, that Mr. Rowe's last expression had been serene. Unnervingly serene. She hadn't seen him herself, of course, but Gertie had mentioned it to the milkman, and the milkman had told Reverend Aldersley, who had mentioned it to her. In Chipping Woodleigh, This counted as eyewitness testimony. He was poisoned, declared Mr. Cramley the butcher, tapping the glass counter with a meaty finger. I said so from the first. No marks, no struggle, poison, quiet kind. The sort that puts you to sleep, like a lamb or a trap, added Mrs. Liddell. Who ran the sweet shop? What was he doing at Lavender End again? Didn't that Templeton fellow sell it off a year ago? No. He inherited it, corrected her sister, after Lady Constance died. Rather sudden, wasn't it? And no post-mortem, either. She was 92, snapped Mr. Cramley. Post-mortems don't grow on trees. Still, the idea took root. Whispers grew richer in detail with each retelling. That Lady Constance had left everything to Basil Templeton. That on Merrick Row had been her solicitor. That he was there to confront Basil with unpleasant paperwork. That there had been arguments, not heard, but certainly imagined, in the orchard, behind the rose arbor, where the sunlight couldn't quite reach Dot at the Red Squirrel pub. Patrons leaned in close over their pint glasses. I heard he was engaged once, said Arnold Hewish, the mail carrier, to someone from the hall. Broke it off under mysterious circumstances. Maybe he was blackmailed. Maybe he was the blackmailer, countered Mavis, the barmaid, who had recently begun dating a constable from the next village, and now considered herself abreast of police procedure. None of it, of course, had been verified. Inspector Denham had returned to Melchester to await the coroner's report. P.C. Larch, meanwhile, made rounds with stiff importance, asking if anyone had seen strangers about or heard odd noises, preferably after dusk. He was particularly suspicious of anyone who had not yet offered an opinion on the matter, which made him wary of Miss Marple. She, after all, had remained utterly silent. Miss Marple had spent the days since the discovery attending to her garden, quietly visiting the churchyard, and once, notably, purchasing 2 lemon drops from Mrs. Liddell with a thoughtful, slightly raised eyebrow. When the woman speculated that the deceased may have been involved in foreign espionage, but it was at Reverend Aldersley's Sunday tea that the gossip reached its most florid crescendo. The vicarage drawing-room was fragrant, with scones, hyacinths, and the strain of careful manners stretched thin by tension. Present were the vicar and his wife, Dr. Haythorpe, and his new fiancée, a woman from Ipswich with a fondness for sudden gasps. Mrs. Partridge and Miss Marple settled near the fire with her knitting in hand. "Do you think it was something in the tea?" asked Mrs. Haythorpe with poorly concealed excitement. "You know, like arsenic in one of those quaint little sandwiches. I read about it in a novel once. Utterly ghastly." "I rather doubt it," replied Miss Marple gently, not looking up. From her needles, the sandwiches were shop-bought, I believe, and arsenic leaves the lips quite discolored, whereas I understand Mr. Rowe was almost rosy. "Rosy?" Mrs. Partridge exclaimed, leaning forward. "How perfectly ghastly. Like a child sleeping in the garden." The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "And Mr. Templeton?" he asked, shifting conversation away from the corpse. "Has anyone spoken to him since?" "No," said Dr. Haythorpe, "and I suspect he's pleased with that arrangement. He never was one for village society." "Perhaps," murmured Miss Marple. But such men rarely enjoy having secrets. That hung in the air for a moment, heavy as treacle. Mrs. Aldersley blinked. "Do you mean he has one?" "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple with a soft smile, "we all do." And with that, she picked up her teacup, sipped quietly, and turned her attention to a small thread in her wool that had started to unravel, as threads often did. When tugged gently enough. In the corner, the fire cracked, and outside the vicarage window, the rose arbor at Lavender End stood still, waiting. It was not until the morning after the tea at the vicarage that Inspector Denham returned to Chipping Woodleigh, driving himself from Melchester in a stuttering constabulary car that plainly disapproved of the village's winding lanes. Denham was a lean, sandy-haired man with a stiff collar and an expression best described as perpetually unconvinced. He had the look of someone who had long ago grown tired of being proven wrong by cleverer people, and who now took out that weariness on every suspect, statement, or strawberry scone. He did not, it should be noted, care for gossip, ideal in facts. He told P.C. Larch sternly as they stood once again beneath the drooping petals of the rose arbor, where the body had been found. Not rumors, not fancies, and certainly not what Mrs. Liddell overheard on the church steps. "Yes, sir," replied Larch, "but it was an odd time of morning for a solicitor to be gardening." "Sir," Denham shot him a look. Rowe wasn't gardening. There wasn't a speck of dirt under his nails, nor was there any gardening tool near him. No, this was a meeting, and someone didn't want him leaving it. He surveyed the rose-covered trellis and the small bench beneath it, already rusting faintly from years of neglect. The flowers had begun to fade in the summer heat, their scent still cloying, as if reluctant to let go. Still waiting on the pathologist's full report, Denham muttered, "But I'll wager it's something subtle. A pill, perhaps, slipped into a drink." He turned back to Larch. Find out what he ate and drank in the 12 hours before his death. Start at Lavender End. See if that Templeton fellow's finally willing to answer a question without quoting his solicitor. Templeton, as it turned out, was not. The man had shut himself into the study of Lavender End and refused to admit even the local clergyman, let alone an officer of the law. His housekeeper, a stooped woman named Miss Pritchard, informed Larch that Mr. Templeton was in a state and could not be disturbed, though he had, she assured him, taken nothing more than a glass of claret and a small wedge of cheese the evening before. That detail would make it into Denham's notebook, but not into his understanding. Later that afternoon, Denham called upon Miss Marple, not because he welcomed her involvement, but because Inspector Craddock, his superior in the division, had once strongly suggested that it never hurts to ask Miss Marple what she thinks. Then ignore her if you like, but ask. He found her in her front parlor, embroidering a set of linen handkerchiefs while a thin breeze stirred the lace curtains. "I shan't take up much of your time," Denham said, clearly hoping it would be true. "I understand you were among the last to see Mr. Rowe alive. Miss Marple offered him tea, which he refused, and a slice of Battenberg, which he accepted and then barely touched. Mr. Rowe seemed rather distracted, she said mildly. He made some remark about unfinished business before excusing himself. That was just before 4 o'clock, and you have no idea what that business might have been. Miss Marple smiled with polite patience. Mr. Rowe was a solicitor. Inspector. That covers a great many sins, I expect. Denham allowed himself a grudging grunt of agreement. Any enemies, do you think? Anyone who might wish him harm? Oh dear, she said, threading her needle. You know, I often think that when people ask that question, they are imagining something quite dramatic. A man with a pistol or a grudge from 1,000 miles away. But it's really like that. In villages like ours, harm often comes from rather closer to home. From things like resentment, embarrassment, or pride. Denham tapped his notepad. Was Rowe proud? Oh yes, she said quietly. But the sort of pride that has edges, like broken glass. The inspector made a small noise of disapproval and stood. Well, if you think of anything real, you let me know. She nodded. Of course. But as he turned to leave, she added, as if it had just occurred to her, though nothing ever just occurred to Miss Marple. Inspector, do you happen to know whether Mr. Rowe's walking stick was found with him? Denham turned. Walking stick? Yes, she said, eyes bright behind her spectacles. He'd had one since his fall last winter. A rather elegant thing, ebony with a brass tip. He leaned on it quite heavily when I saw him just before the fete. But I don't believe it was mentioned in any account of the scene. Denham blinked. No, it wasn't. How very odd, said Miss Marple. People so seldom part with what they depend on, unless they are forced. And with that, she returned to her embroidery, humming a tune from her youth as though the disappearance of a walking stick were nothing more than a misplaced needle. Outside, the rose petals drifted on the warm breeze like falling secrets dot by. The end of the week. Mr. Rowe's name had been uttered more times than in his 40 years of service combined until now. Henry Rowe had occupied a curious position in Chipping Woodleigh. Not beloved, not despised, but acknowledged. As the village solicitor, he had written wills, settled property lines, advised on marital separations with sympathetic discretion, and, perhaps most importantly, remained just distant enough to avoid becoming a fixture at the pub or the church vestry. His grey suits and quiet voice made him blend into the wallpaper of village life. But now that he was dead, people noticed just how many things he had touched, and how many threads he had kept tangled. The first to come forward, as ever, was Mrs. Liddell, having brewed herself into a state of near-hallucinatory confidence. After several conversations at the greengrocer's, I always said he looked tired. She informed Reverend Nash while standing far too close to the font after Sunday service. There's a kind of guilt that eats at the eyes, you know. And he hadn't been to communion in months, always a sign, or possibly just overburdened with work, murmured Miss Marple from the pew behind her, eyes lowered politely. But Miss Marple, for all her modesty, had begun her own inventory of Mr. Rowe's curious habits in the months leading up to his death. He had recently closed 3 separate accounts at the Melchester Bank, 2 in his own name, 1 under a corporate pseudonym, and no one, not even his clerk, seemed to know why. The local baker recalled that he had ceased placing orders for almond cakes, which he used to collect every Thursday, and Mrs. Pritchard at Lavender End had observed him wandering the grounds late at night, pacing, she said, like a man waiting for something that never arrives. These facts, disjointed as they were, began to suggest the shape of a man less orderly than his professional followed. Then there was the matter of the will. When P.C. Larch retrieved the envelope marked testament row from the desk drawer in the solicitor's office, no one expected drama. But the document, witnessed only a week before his death, named a single beneficiary, Miss Flora Templeton. Not shared, not conditional, complete dotted raised eyebrows, to put it mildly, his entire estate. Inspector Denham asked, rereading the paper in the vicarage drawing room. Property, savings, pension, everything. That's what it says, replied Mr. Morrison, the senior partner of Rowe's firm in Melchester. It's all legal, if deeply unorthodox. Flora herself was visibly shaken. But I never. He didn't even tell me, she murmured, clutching a damp handkerchief in her pale hands. He always treated me with kindness. But this, I never expected. Her brother, the stiff, tight-lipped Oliver, was less composed. It's absurd, he barked. He was our solicitor, not family. This is a manipulation, or worse, a setup, to which Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fire, gently replied. Sometimes the difference between affection and obligation is only visible after death, and by then, of course, it's too late to correct the record. The Reverend cleared his throat nervously. We mustn't jump to conclusions. Mr. Rowe was a man of discretion. We don't know what kind of friendship or mentorship existed between him and Miss Templeton. No, we don't, agreed Miss Marple. But I do wonder if he was protecting something or someone. There was a pause, during which the fire crackled and Flora blinked at the carpet with wide, damp eyes. It was Miss Marple who eventually rose and addressed the room. With calm politeness, I've always found, in these sad matters, that the question is not only what the deceased left behind, but whom they feared it might go to, if they did nothing at all. She said it to no one in particular, yet Oliver Templeton looked like he'd swallowed a tack. Later that evening, Miss Marple stood in her garden, clipping the spent blooms from her peonies. She hummed quietly and considered how often men cloaked their fear in legal language. Wills, deeds, codicils, they were only masks, really, but the fears they hid were often very plain. Loneliness, disgrace, or the unquiet weight of secrets left untold. She paused and glanced toward Lavender, and its windows dim behind the creeping vines. Oh yes, she murmured to no one. There is more to Mr. Rowe than ledgers and locks. Much more. And with that, she went inside and reached for her notebook, the small one she kept in the bureau drawer, beneath the recipes and old birthday cards. In every village crime, there is always a figure upon whom suspicion settles like a crow on a steeple, obvious, unmoving, and entirely to convenient dot in this case. That figure was Mr. Oliver Templeton, though no one said it outright in those early days. The way heads turned when he entered the high street. The way conversations abruptly stalled when his boots scraped the tiles of the butcher's shop. These said plenty. His sister may have inherited the estate, but Oliver, it seemed, had inherited the gossip. The situation did not help itself. Oliver had been, by his own admission, in negotiations with Mr. Rowe regarding the sale of a piece of family land, a sloped, half-cleared parcel near the river. He had expected the deal to be signed within the week, with the proceeds earmarked for the purchase of new machinery. That deal had now vanished with the solicitor's final breath. Worse still, several villagers recalled an argument between the two men the week before the murder. Miss Blythe, whose hearing was poor, but whose window overlooked the post office, claimed she'd seen Oliver lean across Mr. Rowe's bonnet and shout something along the lines of, "You'll regret crossing me." Could have been anything, Archie Digby said in the Red Fox Tavern. He's a brash sort, Oliver, but not a killer. I'm not so sure, muttered the landlord. Brash men don't like being bested. When the police arrived again, this time with more serious intent, Oliver's demeanor shifted from cold to brittle. Inspector Denham questioned him at Lavender End. Seated in the same rose-flecked parlor where Henry Rowe had spent his last afternoon. "You had reason to believe Mr. Rowe was cheating you?" Denham asked. Oliver scoffed. He was dragging his feet. "It was infuriating, yes, but I didn't murder him. And yet he left everything to your sister. Unexpected, don't you think?" "I've always said Flora was his favorite," Oliver snapped. "He treated her like a niece. She read to him when he was ill. I did the practical things, cleared gutters, kept the fencing sound. But none of that earns you sentiment." Inspector Denham tapped his pen once against his notebook. "Do you often walk the garden path behind the rose arbor?" "Only when I'm weeding, or trimming the hedge." "You were seen there Thursday evening." Oliver stiffened. "By whom?" Denham raised a brow. "We'll come to that. For now, what were you doing?" Oliver paused too long. "Thinking. I'd had a rough day. About money, family. I don't know. Things. Denham wrote, outside the parlor. Miss Marple walked slowly along the narrow path that bordered the arbor itself. The roses had begun to turn, not yet in bloom, but already thick with promise. She paused near the bench where Rowe had so often sat, his soft cap always tucked precisely beside him. Her sharp eyes scanned the grass dot. Something glittered faintly. She bent down with a small "oh, dear me," and retrieved what appeared to be a button, small, dark, and pearl-backed. Not especially rare, but not especially ordinary either. She slipped it into her pocket without fuss. Later, at the vicarage tea, the Reverend asked gently, "Do you think Oliver capable of such a thing, Miss Marple?" She stirred her tea. "Oh, most certainly, but so are many others. And what's more dangerous than a guilty man who appears angry? A guilty man who seems perfectly at peace." The Reverend blinked. "You think someone is pretending, Miss?" Marple offered her usual, serene smile. "I think many people are pretending. It's the English way." She looked down at her knitting. Two stitches had gone awry. She didn't correct them. Mistakes, after all, had a way of revealing far more than patterns. If the English countryside has one reliable trait beyond damp mornings and stubborn hedgerows, it is its fondness for tea and talk. And Miss Marple knew precisely when both could yield the richest harvest of human nature. On the Monday following Mr. Rowe's burial, Mrs. Elsie Pendlebury hosted a small gathering at her ivy-strangled cottage just beyond the allotments. Though the pretext was to raise funds for the new church roof tiles, everyone understood the true attraction: news, thinly veiled in concern, spiced with rumor, and served with cream sponge. Miss Marple was, of course, invited. Mrs. Pendlebury made a point of saying it aloud in the grocer's queue, a social announcement, not an invitation, that Miss Marple's name was spoken just as loudly as Mrs. Mottram's, and twice as often as the vicar's wife made it all quite official. "Do sit by the hearth, Jane," Elsie said when she arrived, with a theatrical wave toward the oldest armchair. "You always look as if you've stepped out of a Dickens novel when you sit there. So proper." "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her shawl. "It's always a pleasure to be among the roses, even indoors." The others had gathered in gentle clusters: Mrs. Mottram, Miss Snipe, young Mrs. Vickers with her new baby, and, notably, Miss Judith Denholm, who had once been governess to Flora Templeton before a sprained ankle and early retirement turned her into the village's informal librarian. As the tea made its rounds, conversation curled and wound like ivy across a garden wall. "It's too awful," said Mrs. Mottram, dabbing under her eyes although they remained dry. Mr. Rowe was such a presence, always knew the right thing to say, and so generous. Why? He once paid for the repair of our church gate entirely on his own. That was only after he reversed his motor into it. Miss Snipe muttered, not quite softly enough. He was still generous, Mrs. Mottram insisted, and clever. He knew more about everyone than we knew about ourselves. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. Judith Denholm sipped her tea with delicacy, though her eyes were sharp. He certainly knew Flora's business better than she liked. I once overheard him warning her not to trust his certain young solicitor from Bath. "Which one?" asked Miss Snipe with a quick glance at Miss Marple. "Not Henry Dawlish," Judith nodded once. "Tall, always with a yellow cravat. Quite the peacock." "I rather liked the cravat," Mrs. Vickers whispered. "Mr. Rowe didn't," Judith said. "He said a man who dresses loudly thinks too little and talks too much." "Astute," said Miss Marple gently, looking up. "And was he right?" Judith hesitated. "Well, Flora did stop seeing Mr. Dawlish rather suddenly." Miss Marple offered no comment. She only returned to her knitting, the needles tapping gently like the ticking of a patient clock. Later, as Mrs. Pendlebury refilled cups, she leaned down toward Miss Marple and whispered, "They say Mr. Rowe had rewritten his will just a fortnight ago, do they?" said Miss Marple. "The old one left something to the vicar's fund. This one, apparently, did not." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. How quickly kindness fades after death. "It's odd, isn't it?" Elsie said. "I mean, if you were about to change your will, would you take a walk alone under the rose arbor with your solicitor?" especially when your sister had already said she didn't approve of him?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Quite odd. Unless, of course, you didn't expect the conversation to end quite so permanently." As the gathering dwindled and shawls were fetched from hooks, Miss Marple remained seated. She watched as Judith helped Mrs. Vickers with her baby's bonnet, and as Mrs. Mottram murmured something about a headache, she observed the glances, the gestures, the way the conversation thinned and thickened like overboiled jam. No one spoke of Oliver Templeton, and that, she noted to herself, was curious, because in a village like this, when someone is no longer being spoken of, it usually means they're being protected or watched. The morning after Mrs. Pendlebury's tea, Miss Marple found herself in her modest sitting room, bathed in a gentle light that filtered through the lace curtains. On her lap lay a half-finished shawl in a soft clover green wool, but her eyes were not on the needles. They rested instead on a modest envelope, just delivered by young Tommy Parsons, the postman, who had remarked how quiet the village had been since the funeral. Like a dog what's lost the scent, miss. The envelope bore no return address, but Miss Marple recognized the tidy script at once. Flora Templeton, likely writing out of habit rather than desire. Inside, she had enclosed a folded page with careful but clipped thanks for Miss Marple's kindness during the burial, and a rather telling line near the end. It is dreadful what you begin to notice when someone is gone. Things like a drawer being left half-opened, or how he never did finish weeding the path beneath the kitchen window. Miss Marple read that line twice, then again. Her eyes narrowed. She rose and went to her small bookshelf, where she kept a modest diary of local happenings. An old habit, half sentimental, half investigative. On a page dated 3 weeks before Mr. Rowe's death, she had scribbled a few observations about the Templeton garden, west fence gate repaired, Mr. Rowe pruning roses, Mrs. Templeton ill indoors. She fetched her shawl and walking stick, and, after leaving a note for her housekeeper, made her way along the quiet hedgerows to Lavender End. The garden was calm. Its silence was no longer the hush of respect, but the kind that followed a storm and left things unnatural. The bird song was halting. The roses drooped slightly, unpruned. Flora was not home. A neighbor confirmed she'd gone into Market Basing to meet with a solicitor. Miss Marple, never one to waste a useful errand, gently asked if she might walk through the garden to leave a few cuttings she brought. "Of course," said the neighbor, "though do mind the arbor. It's still cordoned." Miss Marple made her way along the path, eyes low, movements slow. By the moss-lined stones under the kitchen window, she paused. The soil there was firm, but not untouched. Someone had knelt there recently. The weight of a knee had left an impression near the edge of a flowering begonia, and nestled half buried beneath the leaves was a single brass button. Small, flat, with a fine rim of black enamel and faint ridges on the underside. Too elegant for a gardener, too discreet for a lady's coat, and most certainly not something a man like Mr. Rowe would have worn in summer. Miss Marple bent down, wrapped it in her handkerchief, and slipped it into her basket. Returning to the path, she stopped before the rose arbor. The cord and tape had long since slackened in the breeze, and the yellow roses had begun to wilt where they had not been watered. She stood there for a long while, tracing the air with her gaze, from the arbor to the back window of the house, then across the lawn to the hedge that screened the property from the adjoining lane. And there it was again, that unsettling sense of order not aligning with life. Roe, everyone had said, was found lying beneath the arbor as if in sleep. But why had no one asked why he'd gone out in his slippers? Why had no one mentioned the open drawer Flora had written of, or the oddity of a man so meticulous leaving anything unfinished? More importantly, why had someone with a button like this been standing where Mr. Roe had not? The clue was not the button itself, but the absence it suggested, the gap in people's assumptions, the assumed neatness of a tidy death in a garden, the expected grief, the convenient conclusions. Miss Marple returned home just as the church bell struck one. In her kitchen, she placed the button in a small tin and labeled it with a strip of paper. Kitchen bed, N.E. Corner, 11:45 a.m. Then she made herself a pot of tea, sat at her window, and watched the village road with quiet anticipation. Someone, she suspected, would come walking past soon, wearing a coat that had once had 5 buttons. As the sun tilted westward, casting long shadows across the hedgerows of St. Aldhelm, something began to shift in the air. A faint tension that gripped the village just behind its polite smiles and basket-carrying errands. Miss Marple, from her position at the edge of all things central, observed the familiar pattern of social adjustment that follows a death not yet understood. That afternoon, Mrs. Bantry invited a small group of ladies to tea, ostensibly to lift spirits and return the village to some semblance of normalcy. But as Miss Marple well knew, such gatherings were less about refreshment and more about recalibration. In the clinking of china and the murmur of anecdote, real truths often surfaced, half-formed, evasive, and revealing in what was not said. The tea table at the Bantrys was well laid. Scones, lemon sponge, shortbread, and a delicate fruit. Preserve rumoured to have cost an unspeakable sum at Harrod's. Around it sat the usual circle, Mrs. Price Ridley with her frown lines deeper than ever, young Sylvia Woodhouse with her nervous giggle and ever-watchful eyes, Mrs. Ellison, still wearing mourning for a cousin lost some 5 years past, and, of course, Miss Marple, with her knitting quietly underway and her ears ever alert. The conversation began with conventional laments. How sad it was. How unexpected. How dreadfully quiet the Templeton house had become. And such a loss for poor Flora, said Mrs. Bantry, shaking her head. A woman who's endured more than her share. More than her share, indeed, murmured Mrs. Ellison. What with her health and her finances and the gossip about her sister, Miss Marple glanced up, just slightly. What gossip? Asked Mrs. Price Ridley, with her characteristic hunger sharpened. Oh, I don't listen to it, said Mrs. Ellison primly. But you know how people talk. That Rowena never did quite settle after her Paris years, some said. She had a friend there, a very close friend. There was a flutter of teacups. Miss Marple kept her eyes fixed on her knitting. I don't hold with all that modern nonsense. declared Mrs. Price Ridley. But Rowena Templeton was a bold one. She once wore trousers to the Vicarage garden party, and I shall never forget it. She was also clever, said Sylvia softly. I always thought she and Mr. Rowe had something in common, you know, like minds. He spoke French beautifully, did he? Said Miss Marple mildly. And yet his service record lists only Flanders and Artois. Curious, don't you think? Sylvia flushed and turned to her cake. The talk soon shifted to war pensions, to the state of the bakery's custard, to the new vicar's poor selection of hymns. But Miss Marple's mind remained in that small eddy of conversation where past affections and unspoken alliances had briefly surfaced. One name had been notably absent from the lips of all but Sylvia, Rowena Templeton. Everyone talked about Mr. Rowe. Everyone mourned with Flora. No one, however, quite knew what to make of the younger sister. Later that evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to her old friend Dr. Haydock, bringing him a jar of gooseberry jam in exchange for a few candid thoughts. He, like most, had assumed heart failure or stroke. Nothing too suspicious, given Rowe's age. But as they spoke, he confessed something that hadn't sat right. No sign of panic, he'd said. Not a bruise, not a scratch, and yet the expression, not fear, exactly, but surprise. As if he'd recognized something, or someone, and had no time to process it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Before bed, she returned to her small tin and examined the button again. It was not frayed. It had not snapped in haste. It had been undone and dropped. Secrets, she mused, had a way of surfacing not in shouts, but in silences, in the strange absence of grief, in the names no one mentioned at tea, and somewhere just beyond the tidy hedges of St. Aldhelm. Someone still believed their story, their version of events, had passed unnoticed. They were wrong. By the following week, the village of St. Aldhelm had nestled into a false sense of resolution. Detective Inspector Cray, a capable but overly determined man, had, in his own words, a strong lead and a likely culprit. And the likely culprit, in his view, was Mr. George Barrow, the village's reclusive bookseller and long-time acquaintance of the late Rowe Templeton. Miss Marple heard it first from young Constable Fenn, who let it slip, rather proudly. In the greengrocer's queue, they've got their eye on Barrow, he whispered, puffing his chest slightly. Knew the victim for years. Argument a few months back. Loud enough for old Mrs. Finch to hear it to doors down. Over money, she says. Barrow had always struck Miss Marple as a quiet man with uneven manners, but a kind eye. He had once given her a second-hand volume of Trollope when her own went missing, and he often left fresh-cut rosemary outside the library steps. He also, it must be said, had a tendency to vanish for long stretches, walking alone for miles, along the edge of the downs with a flask and a worn satchel. The police seemed content to circle him like hounds. They discovered that Rowe had helped Barrow secure a small inheritance dispute some years back, and that Barrow had once attended Rowe's now infamous Thursday night poetry salons. Cray spoke of them as if they were gatherings of anarchists and radicals. Intimate, he called them, private, unaccountable. I dare say chess clubs are just as private. Miss Marple remarked to Reverend Pritchard, and far more cutthroat. But as the net closed in on Barrow, Miss Marple's doubts crystallized. For one thing, George Barrow was not a man who played games. His awkwardness with people, his deeply regimented days, his habit of talking to cats, all pointed to a man uncomfortable with manipulation. A man like Barrow, Miss Marple believed, could kill, anyone could, under strain, but not like this. Not with clean hands, a vanished motive, and a perfectly timed disappearance. She noticed something else, too. In all the talk of suspects, and they were many, the desperate niece Flora, the ambitious local councillor Mr. Chooks, the mysterious Miss Elodie Gray with her veiled past. Barrow's name only surfaced once Rose Thursday gatherings were brought up. It was as though Cray had seized on the idea of impropriety and built a case around it. He fancied himself in love. Cray had said with a sneer, "Those quiet ones always do." To Miss Marple, that remark revealed more about Cray than Barrow. It was during a walk through the churchyard, ostensibly to admire the early lupins, that she happened upon Mrs. Finch, the same Mrs. Finch who had overheard Barrow and Rose's argument. Miss Marple engaged her in gentle talk about bulbs and birdseed before circling delicately back to the conversation. "Oh yes, I heard them," Mrs. Finch confirmed, quarreling just outside the shop. She was angry. He was apologizing. About money, the police say. Oh no, dear. It wasn't about money. It was about a story she'd told in the village newsletter, I believe. Something about an old solicitor who'd taken advantage of a widow. Mr. Barrow was most upset. Miss Marple's needles clicked to a halt in her mind. That was not how the police had framed it. She said she hadn't named names, continued Mrs. Finch. But Mr. Barrow thought it was rather too close to a case he knew. Something from years ago. In London, he called it careless, bordering on cruel. I remember because it was such a dramatic phrase for him. Miss Marple gave her thanks and continued her walk, heart pricked with a new awareness. This was not a man furious with Roe Templeton for debt or jealousy. This was a man hurt by how she used stories. By the time she returned to her cottage, she had pulled from memory the issue of the newsletter in question, stored carefully under old linens, as many things were in her house. There it was, the tale in question, written under the title The Gentleman's Signature. It hinted darkly at betrayal, litigation, and falsified documents. A fine piece of writing, clever and biting, but for someone with first-hand knowledge of the case, perhaps too close for comfort. Barrow, then, may have had cause for anguish, but not for murder. And so, Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the entire village was being nudged toward a neat, convenient rest crystallized. Someone cleverer than Cray, cleverer perhaps than the victim herself, was shaping the story with precision, laying breadcrumbs, crafting a red herring of dignity and grief. But Miss Marple had read too many books and lived through too many chapters to stop at the ending everyone else had accepted. Somewhere beneath the surface, behind the poised faces and polite distractions, the real narrative waited, and Miss Marple intended to turn the next page, The news broke mid-morning, as news often did in St. Aldhelm, not through telephones or radio bulletins, but by word of mouth. Embroidered over hedges, market stalls, and laundry lines, Elodie Gray was missing. Or rather, she was not where she was expected to be, and no one had seen her since the previous afternoon. Mrs. Sproat, the formidable housekeeper of Lavender End, had been the first to notice. She'd prepared Miss Gray's breakfast at her usual. Our tea, soft-boiled egg, lightly buttered toast, and knocked once, then twice, upon her bedroom door. No answer, assuming she'd overslept or risen early. Mrs. Sproat had left the tray on the sideboard and returned an hour later. Still no sound. Then came the panic. The door was locked from the inside. By the time Constable Fenn arrived, pale-faced and fumbling with his notepad, the local doctor had already been summoned and a ladder procured from the church vestry. The window to Miss Gray's room was narrow, but not impassable. Fenn climbed it with the sort of breathless clumsiness that made more noise than progress. And when at last the bolt was drawn, and the door opened, everyone leaned forward to hear what horror had unfolded. But there was no body. The room was empty, not in disarray, not even particularly unkempt. The bed had been slept in. The wash basin bore traces of lavender soap, and a pair of walking shoes were neatly lined beside the rug. But of Miss Elodie Gray, there was no trace, no open window, no hidden door, no sign of violence or flight. She vanished, said Reverend Pritchard solemnly at tea that afternoon, from a locked room with no key and no ladder drawn. People don't vanish, said Miss Marple mildly, spooning clotted cream onto a scone. They are hidden, or they hide themselves. But she was frightened, Flora insisted. You saw her the day before. That business with Mr. Templeton's poetry volume. It rattled her, and she told me, after lunch, that she might leave early. She didn't say why. Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing. What she did say, later, to herself, as she watered her nasturtiums, was this: fear often looks like guilt to those who don't wish to see either. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray seized the opportunity with both hands. You see, he declared, pacing Wolf's General Store in front of a growing crowd. Flight implies guilt. Miss Gray was hiding something from the beginning. That business with the letters, the locked trunk, the made-up address in Yorkshire. Miss Marple, who had overheard this while examining a tin of anchovies, said nothing. What struck her most was not Elodie Gray's disappearance, though that was indeed troubling, but the calm with which she had arranged it. The room had no signs of a hasty exit. Her clothes had not been rifled through, nor any drawers left open. No letter, no tearful goodbye. A ghost's exit, wrapped in silence. And yet there had been signs. Hadn't there? Miss Gray's tension. The glance she'd exchanged with Mr. Chooks during the vicarage lunch. The dropped spoon when Roe Templeton's name was mentioned in connection with the land grant scandal of '48. Little fragments, like bits of thread, tugged from a tapestry no one wished to unravel. More concerning still was the little book Miss Marple had noticed missing. The slim blue-bound volume of poetry that had sat for years in Lavender End's study, untouched beside a stack of gardening almanacs. Templeton's book, the one he gave only to those he trusted or wished to manipulate. And it was gone by nightfall. Speculation had grown thick as ivy. Some believed Elodie had taken her own life and her body would be found in the river. Others insisted she'd escaped to London, her past nipping at her heels. And some whispered what no one wanted to say aloud, that the murderer of Roe Templeton had now struck again, and this time the body had simply not yet surfaced. But Miss Marple, seated by her window, watched the wind shift over the rose arbor and thought differently. "This isn't the work of a desperate woman," she said softly, knitting half a row before pausing. "It's the work of someone else entirely. Someone who wanted the village to look left, while they quietly walked out right. Tomorrow, she would pay a visit to a very old friend, a solicitor in Kingsbridge, who remembered every land deed signed within 50 miles of St. Aldhelm, and she would ask about a name that had been scratched out of the Lavender End property ledger in 1934, but never quite forgotten. There was, in Miss Marple's experience, a difference between confusion and chaos. Confusion belonged to the living, to policemen chasing wrong leads, to villagers inventing gossip in the absence of truth. Chaos, however, belonged to the criminal mind, deliberate, composed, concealed. And this business of a vanished girl, a dead solicitor, a missing book of poems, and a locked room that opened onto nothing, had very little confusion in it at all. It was tidy, almost too tidy. Miss Marple stood by the churchyard wall that afternoon, her shawl wrapped tight against the rising wind, and watched young Matthew Larch clean the brass lanterns. By the gate, "Young man," she said, kindly, "do you still help Mr. Carmichael at the post office sometimes?" Matthew looked up, startled. "Yes, ma'am. I help sort on Wednesdays." "Why? Did Miss Gray post anything the day before she disappeared?" The boy squinted. "Might have done. There was a blue envelope with a red wax seal. I remember because I cut my thumb trying to slot it. Thick paper. Old-fashioned. And do you recall the name on it?" He paused, thinking. "Initials are CT, I think. Not local. Though it had a..." Puffing his chest slightly. "Knew the victim for years. Argument a few months back. Loud enough for old Mrs. Finch to hear it to doors down. Over money, she says." Barrow had always struck Miss Marple as a quiet man with uneven manners, but a kind eye. He had once given her a second-hand volume of Trollope when her own went missing, and he often left fresh-cut rosemary outside the library steps. He also, it must be said, had a tendency to vanish for long stretches, walking alone for miles along the edge of the downs with a flask and a worn satchel. The police seemed content to circle him like hounds. They discovered that Roe had helped Barrow secure a small inheritance dispute some years back, and that Barrow had once attended Roe's now infamous Thursday night poetry salons. Cray spoke of them as if they were gatherings of anarchists and radicals. Intimate, he called them private, unaccountable. I dare say chess clubs are just as private, Miss Marple remarked to Reverend Pritchard, and far more cutthroat. But as the net closed in on Barrow, Miss Marple's doubts crystallized. For one thing, George Barrow was not a man who played games. His awkwardness with people, his deeply regimented days, his habit of talking to cats, all pointed to a man uncomfortable with manipulation. A man like Barrow, Miss Marple believed, could kill. Anyone could. Under strain, but not like this. Not with clean hands, a vanished motive, and a perfectly timed disappearance. She noticed something else, too. In all the talk of suspects, and they were many, the desperate niece Flora, the ambitious local councillor Mr. Tukes, the mysterious Miss Elodie Gray with her veiled past, Barrow's name, only surfaced once Rose Thursday gatherings, were brought up. It was as though Cray had seized on the idea of impropriety and built a case around it. He fancied himself in love. Cray had said with a sneer, "Those quiet ones always do." To Miss Marple, that remark revealed more about Cray than Barrow. It was during a walk through the churchyard, ostensibly to admire the early lupins, that she happened upon Mrs. Finch, the same Mrs. Finch who had overheard Barrow and Rose's argument. Miss Marple engaged her in gentle talk about bulbs and birdseed, before circling delicately back to the conversation. "Oh yes, I heard them," Mrs. Finch confirmed, quarreling just outside the shop. She was angry. He was apologizing. About money, the police say. Oh no, dear. It wasn't about money. It was about a story she'd told in the village newsletter, I believe. Something about an old solicitor who'd taken advantage of a widow. Mr. Barrow was most upset. Miss Marple's needles clicked to a halt in her mind. That was not how the police had framed it. She said she hadn't named names. Continued Mrs. Finch. But Mr. Barrow thought it was rather too close to a case he knew. Something from years ago, in London. He called it careless, bordering on cruel. I remember because it was such a dramatic phrase for him. Miss Marple gave her thanks and continued her walk, heart pricked with a new awareness. This was not a man furious with Roe Templeton for debt or jealousy. This was a man hurt by how she used stories. By the time she returned to her cottage, she had pulled from memory the issue of the newsletter in question, stored carefully under old linens, as many things were in her house. There it was, the tale in question, written under the title The Gentleman's Signature. It hinted darkly at betrayal, litigation, and falsified documents. A fine piece of writing, clever and biting, but for someone with first-hand knowledge of the case. Perhaps too close for comfort. Barrow, then, may have had cause for anguish, but not for murder. And so, Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the entire village was being nudged toward a neat, convenient rest crystallized. Someone cleverer than Cray, cleverer perhaps than the victim herself, was shaping the story with precision, laying breadcrumbs, crafting a red herring of dignity and grief. But Miss Marple had read too many books and lived through too many chapters to stop at the ending everyone else had accepted. Somewhere beneath the surface, behind the poised faces and polite distractions, the real narrative waited, and Miss Marple intended to turn the next page. The news broke mid-morning, as news often did in St. Aldhelm, not through telephones or radio bulletins, but by word of mouth, embroidered over hedges, market stalls, and laundry lines. Elodie Gray was missing, or rather, she was not where she was expected to be, and no one had seen her since the previous afternoon. Mrs. Sprout, the formidable housekeeper of Lavender End, had been the first to notice. She'd prepared Miss Gray's breakfast at her usual hour: tea, soft-boiled egg, lightly buttered toast, and knocked once, then twice, upon her bedroom door. No answer. Assuming she'd overslept or risen early, Mrs. Sprout had left the tray on the sideboard and returned an hour later. Still no sound. Then came the panic. The door was locked from the inside. By the time Constable Fenn arrived, pale-faced and fumbling with his notepad, the local doctor had already been summoned and a ladder procured from the church vestry. The window to Miss Gray's room was narrow, but not impassable. Fenn climbed it with the sort of breathless clumsiness that made more noise than progress, and when at last the bolt was drawn and the door opened, everyone leaned forward to hear what horror had unfolded. But there was no body. The room was empty. Not in disarray, not even particularly unkempt. The bed had been slept in, the wash basin bore traces of lavender soap, and a pair of walking shoes were neatly lined beside the rug. But of Miss Elodie Gray there was no trace, no open window, no hidden door, no sign of violence or flight. She vanished, said Reverend Pritchard solemnly at tea that afternoon. From a locked room with no key and no ladder drawn, people don't vanish, said Miss Marple mildly, spooning clotted cream onto a scone. They are hidden, or they hide themselves. But she was frightened, Flora insisted. You saw her the day before. That business with Mr. Templeton's poetry volume. It rattled her, and she told me, after lunch, that she might leave early. She didn't say why. Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing. What she did say, later, to herself, as she watered her nasturtiums, was this: fear often looks like guilt to those who don't wish to see either. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray seized the opportunity with both hands. You see, he declared, pacing Wolf's General Store in front of a growing crowd. Flight implies guilt. Miss Gray was hiding something. From the beginning. That business with the letters, the locked trunk, the made-up address in Yorkshire. Miss Marple, who had overheard this while examining a tin of anchovies, said nothing. What struck her most was not Elodie Gray's disappearance, though. That was indeed troubling, but the calm with which she had arranged it. The room had no signs of a hasty exit. Her clothes had not been rifled through, nor any drawers left open. No letter, no tearful goodbye. A ghost's exit, wrapped in silence. And yet there had been signs, hadn't there? Miss Gray's tension, the glance she'd exchanged with Mr. Chooks during the vicarage lunch, the drop spoon when Roe Templeton's name was mentioned in connection with the land grant scandal of '48, little fragments, like bits of thread, tugged from a tapestry no one wished to unravel. More concerning still was the little book Miss Marple had noticed missing, the slim blue-bound volume of poetry that had sat for years in Lavender End's study, untouched beside a stack of gardening almanacs. Templeton's book, the one he gave only to those he trusted or wished to manipulate. And it was gone. By nightfall. Speculation had grown thick as ivy. Some believed Elodie had taken her own life and her body would be found in the river. Others insisted she'd escaped to London, her past nipping at her heels. And some whispered what no one wanted to say aloud, that the murderer of Roe Templeton had now struck again, and this time the body had simply not yet surfaced. But Miss Marple, seated by her window, watched the wind shift over the rose arbor and thought differently. "This isn't the work of a desperate woman," she said softly, knitting half a row before pausing. "It's the work of someone else entirely. Someone who wanted the village to look left, while they quietly walked. Outright. Tomorrow, she would pay a visit to a very old friend, a solicitor in Kingsbridge, who remembered every land deed signed within 50 miles of St. Aldhelm. And she would ask about a name that had been scratched out of the Lavender End property ledger in 1934, but never quite forgotten. There was, in Miss Marple's experience, a difference between confusion and chaos. Confusion belonged to the living, to policemen chasing wrong leads, to villagers inventing gossip in the absence of truth. Chaos, however, belonged to the criminal mind, deliberate, composed, concealed. And this business of a vanished girl, a dead solicitor, a missing book of poems, and a locked room that opened onto nothing, had very little confusion in it at all. It was tidy, almost too tidy. Miss Marple stood by the churchyard wall that afternoon, her shawl wrapped tight against the rising wind, and watched young Matthew Larch clean the brass lanterns. By the gate, "Young man," she said, kindly, "do you still help Mr. Carmichael at the post office?" "Sometimes." Matthew looked up, startled. "Yes, ma'am. I help sort on Wednesdays." "Why? Did Miss Gray post anything the day before she disappeared?" The boy squinted. "Might have done. There was a blue envelope with a red wax seal. I remember because I cut my thumb trying to slot it. Thick paper. Old-fashioned. And do you recall the name on it?" He paused, thinking. "Initials are CT, I think. Not local. Though it had a London return address. Thank you, Matthew. That's very helpful." She smiled, and the boy grinned shyly, unsure whether he'd helped solve a murder or merely earned a peppermint. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short note, just 2 sentences, and posted it by hand to an acquaintance at the British Library, one of the few places where the name Roland Charles Templeton still meant something. The next morning, over tea with Vicar Pritchard, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. People often forget that love and loyalty don't always point in the same direction, she said absently. The vicar, nursing a weak Earl Grey, looked up. "You think Miss Gray was protecting someone?" "I think," she said, watching a sparrow hop across the sill, "she was protecting something. Perhaps even something as quaint as decency. Or shame. She didn't add that in her own youth. Long ago, in an Edinburgh boarding house, she had known a girl much like Elodie Gray, quiet, fiercely intelligent, and entirely willing to take the blame for others, provided it preserved something more valuable than reputation. Not innocence, integrity. At Lavender End, Mrs. Sproat had returned to her stoic order. The house had been dusted, the linens pressed, but the mood hung low. like a fog that refused to lift. Miss Marple noticed the orchids first, not in the garden, but in a pressed flower frame on the hallway wall. Faded now, but unmistakable. A particular breed that only bloomed in temperate shade and only grew, to her knowledge, in a handful of corners in England. Templeton had them imported ones, according to an old article she'd clipped years ago from the Amateur Botanist. It mentioned offhand that he'd given the seedlings to a private friend in Oxford, a Mr. R.C. Templeton. The initials matched the envelope Matthew had mentioned, and that was the moment Miss Marple knew. Not guessed, knew. She spent the rest of the day quietly visiting the garden centre, then stopping by the old schoolhouse where she spoke briefly to Miss Blythe about the estate boundaries along the river path. By the time dusk settled over St. Aldhelm, she had all she needed. The lie was not in what had been said, but what hadn't. The missing book, the vanished girl, the frame with the pressed orchids. What Elodie had seen wasn't murder, not at first. What she'd seen was identity. And the thing about secrets, Miss Marple thought as she boiled her evening egg, was that they never stayed buried forever, even under roses. All that was left was a slip, something small, something inevitable. And so she wrote 2 notes, one to Inspector Cray and one to Flora Templeton. The first was an invitation. The second, a trap, served politely, with tea, lavender, and had the air of a house trying not to remember. Since the murder, the hedges had been clipped more obsessively, the windows washed with greater vigor, and the tea towels changed 3 times as often. It was as if by polishing the silver or airing the parlour, Mrs. Sproat might scrub the scent of death from the wainscoting. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 4. She had, of course, brought a cake, a simple lemon sponge, and a packet of her own blackcurrant jam. She insisted on helping in the kitchen, and Mrs. Sproat, too mannered to refuse, permitted her with a sigh. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said cheerfully, "your kettle's slow to boil. My niece had one just like it. It hissed for ages and never quite managed a proper whistle." Mrs. Sproat, pouring sugar into the cut glass bowl, barely looked up. "It suits me." Miss Marple nodded, then asked, almost as an afterthought, "Do you suppose Elodie took the good silver teaspoons with her?" "I do hope she didn't. It would make an already dreadful matter so much worse." Mrs. Sproat's hand froze on the tray. "What?" "The set with the small vine motif. Quite a lovely pattern. I only noticed they were missing because the drawer in your sideboard was left slightly ajar when I visited last. They're in the drawer by the stove." Mrs. Sproat snapped. "They were moved for polishing." Miss Marple merely blinked, then smiled. "Oh, of course. I do apologize. You must think me dreadfully meddlesome." But the flinch, that brief, taut withdrawal, had been all the confirmation she needed, because the drawer by the stove was where the ladle went, and Miss Marple remembered very well that the entire set of teaspoons had not been there. When she'd last helped serve tea, she had not come for spoons, of course. She had come for Flora. The young woman arrived a few minutes later, cheeks flushed from the walk and hair pinned in a looser style than usual. She wore a mauve frock, unremarkable in cut, but softened at the sleeves, a colour too deliberate to be accidental. Morning softened into elegance. Miss Marple took note. They sat in the drawing-room, the three women, with a tablecloth draped carefully across the tea tray, and the clinking of china as polite as ever. Miss Marple commented on the roses, the weather, and the warbling habits of the thrush near her own hedge. Then she said, quite mildly, "How fond your father must have been of orchids, Miss Templeton." Flora looked up. "He wasn't. Oh, I mean," she stammered slightly, "not especially. That was more Uncle Roland's hobby. Father always said they were fussy things, overbred and easily bruised." "How curious," Miss Marple replied, with a faint trace of disappointment in her voice. "Because I saw a dried orchid, framed, in the hallway near his study. It looked very old, as though it had meant something to him once." The pause that followed was longer than necessary. Perhaps he kept it for sentimental reasons. Flora said, a little too quickly, "My mother pressed flowers sometimes. It may have been hers." "Ah, that would make sense." Miss Marple poured the tea, added the sugar precisely, and handed the cup to Flora with a faint, serene smile. They talked of other things then, small village matters. A raffle at the Women's Institute, the arrival of gooseberries to Weeks, early at the greengrocer. Flora smiled and played her part. But now and then, her gaze would flick back to the hallway. Just once, she excused herself, saying she'd forgotten to let the cat in, and returned looking vaguely flustered. Miss Marple made no remark. But after she left, cake box empty, shawl drawn tight against the breeze, she stopped at the gate and looked back at Lavender End. And she thought, it will be tonight, because guilt was like milk on the boil. You could walk away for a while, pretend it would simmer safely on its own, but it always bubbled over eventually. That evening, she left her parlour window open and the lamp half dimmed. She waited with her knitting in her lap and the letter from the British Library in her pocket. Because tomorrow, when the police came for one final round of questions, Miss Marple would be ready. But the killer, now, was not. The next morning broke damp and close, the sort of weather that clung to one's skin like suspicion. Miss Marple, never one to dismiss a barometer's warning, had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders despite the calendar's insistence that it was June. She arrived early at the vicarage, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book, but in truth to intercept Inspector Cray before his formal round of interviews began. The letter from the British Library was folded neatly inside the gardening book's flyleaf, a quiet weapon waiting for the right moment. Cray, red-eyed and already impatient with village pleasantries, barely glanced at the spine. More chrysanthemums. Miss Marple, chapters 8 and 9, she said mildly, a particular favourite. But I've marked something inside that may be more relevant to your current reading, so to speak. She handed it over, and he frowned, opening the book to find the letter tucked like a pressed flower between pages. He scanned it, slowly at first, then with dawning interest. Miss Marple watched his brows rise. "It confirms what I suspected," she said softly. "The Templeton family's estate contains a greenhouse." "Yes, but not one capable of growing a rare Paphiopedilum drury." That specimen requires a level of care far beyond what Mr. Templeton could have provided, particularly in recent years. Cray blinked, and the dried orchid, framed, yes, but not identified. It was Flora who referred to it by name yesterday. Paphiopedilum drury, not simply orchid. A rare South Indian variety, not easily guessed at unless one has had recent acquaintance. Yet she claimed it belonged to her mother, who died before the plant became popular in English horticultural circles. Cray looked down again at the letter. So, she'd have had to learn the name recently. Exactly. She saw the name on the order form. The order that was never completed, because Mr. Templeton died before it could be delivered. There was a long silence. Cray exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll do it your way, Flora." Templeton was invited, not summoned, to the drawing room at the vicarage. The vicar, bless him, had offered tea and scones and some bumbling talk of hedgerows before excusing himself with an air of gentle confusion. Cray took up the chair near the hearth. Miss Marple sat slightly off-center, her knitting resting in a loose ball beside her. Flora wore blue today, a deep, rich navy, composed, gracious. But her eyes flickered when Miss Marple began. "You mentioned yesterday that the orchid in your father's study was a Paphiopedilum drury," Miss Marple said casually, as though discussing roses again. Such an elegant name, so difficult to pronounce, too. Flora hesitated. "Yes, I believe so. How clever of you to know it." "I had to look it up." Flora shifted in her chair. "Well, I studied botany for a term in university." "Did you indeed? How wonderful. But such a shame the orchid wasn't labeled," Cray added. "Odd, isn't it? For a sentimental keepsake to be so precisely named in your memory." Flora's hand moved instinctively to her locket, a small, heart-shaped thing in pewter. "I suppose I just remembered," she said stiffly. Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as ever. "I wonder if perhaps you remembered more than you ought." There was silence then, long and raw. And then Flora made the fatal error. "He never even meant to order it," she said sharply. "He just talked about it, and then stopped." But the slip had been made. Cray leaned forward. "You said order. How did you know there was an order? That word was never mentioned." Flora started, then faltered. Her face turned pale. Miss Marple quietly picked up her knitting again. "The receipt," she said softly. "The one you removed from your father's drawer and tried to burn in the fireplace. There were still traces in the grate. You know, Mr. Templeton had ordered the orchid, not for himself, but as part of his will. A gesture meant for someone else. You discovered it too soon." The silence thickened. Cray stood. "Miss Flora Templeton, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to accompany me to the station." Flora rose shakily, but her voice, when she spoke again, had a hint of bitterness rather than panic. "You think you understand it, don't you? You think it was about money or pride. But he was going to give it all away, everything, to that charity woman and her orphans, all because she'd nursed him through his illness. He said I didn't deserve it." Miss Marple watched her quietly. "That must have been terribly hard to hear." "It was mine," Flora said through clenched teeth. Lavender End, the only thing that was mine. She didn't cry. She simply walked out with Cray at her side, the heels of her boots clicking sharp across the stone path. Miss Marple looked out the window after them. Dot in the garden. The Celandines had opened again, small yellow faces nodding in the breeze, untouched by any of it. Dot, and in that small, quiet bloom, life went on. Dot, it was not the police station, nor the garden, nor even the parlor at Lavender End that became the stage for the final unmasking. Instead, it was a modest sitting room at the vicarage, with threadbare cushions, polished oak armrests, and the lingering scent of rose hip jam. A room where so many sins had been discussed under the pretext of small talk, and where Miss Marple, seated primly with her knitting in her lap, at last delivered the truth. The guests were few, but chosen well. Inspector Cray, who had grown steadily more respectful in the way one grows respectful of a wasp in one's teacup. The vicar, fidgeting near the window, unable to resist offering dry biscuits at inappropriate moments. Flora Templeton, pale and still, her hands clasped neatly like folded linen, sitting beside her solicitor, Mr. Aldrich, who had arrived that morning with more concern for reputation than remorse. And finally, Mrs. Lavinia Hartley, the matronly head of St. Crispin's Orphan Refuge, whom few suspected would be pivotal, until Miss Marple's gaze paused ever so gently upon her. Miss Marple's voice, when she began, was quiet, almost apologetic, as though she were explaining a minor scheduling conflict. Arthur Templeton, she said, was a man who understood symbolism far more than sentiment. His gift to Mrs. Hartley's charity, and to her personally, was not merely generous. It was a form of redress for something he regretted deeply. Mrs. Hartley flushed. He supported our work generously. That is all. Miss Marple smiled politely, and no doubt admirably. But it is also true that Mr. Templeton knew he was dying, and that he wished, before the end, to transfer not only funds, but something more specific. The deed to Lavender End, a property that Flora Templeton believed would be hers. Flora stirred. He never told me that, she said flatly. No, Miss Marple said, because he didn't trust himself to survive the conversation. He left the deed unsigned on his desk, tucked beneath the order for the orchid. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. And you think Miss Templeton found it first? Miss Marple inclined her head. She did more than find it. She discovered that her father intended not only to disinherit her, but to mark the occasion with a symbolic gesture, the delivery of a rare orchid that, coincidentally, was also her late mother's favorite, a plant that would arrive precisely 1 week after the deed transfer. He had it arranged quite poetically, and I suppose, Flora said tightly, that you imagine I flew into a rage and beat him over the head with a gardening spade. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Oh no, dear. Nothing so inelegant. You knew about his heart condition. You merely needed him to believe you would be gone that weekend. You left, indeed, but returned through the orchard path, the one no longer used. You confronted him with the unsigned deed and the order form. He collapsed. You delayed calling the doctor by an hour. Inspector Cray looked up sharply. The post-mortem said, "I know what the post-mortem said," Miss Marple said gently, "but there is a small bruise on the back of Mr. Templeton's hand, consistent with the pressure of a pen forcibly placed between his fingers. A pen that had dried up. You staged a failed attempt at forgery, not to complete the deed, but to mislead us into thinking someone else had tried." Mrs. Hartley clutched her handbag. "But why frame me?" Flora laughed, low and bitter. "Because he loved you," she said. "Everyone knew it. He talked about you as if you'd saved his soul. I was just the daughter he resented, the ungrateful child." The room fell into silence. Even the vicar, who had not spoken in over 20 minutes, blinked behind his spectacles. "I didn't want him dead," Flora whispered finally. "I just wanted him to see what it felt like, to know what it meant to be discarded." Miss Marple nodded, a faint sadness in her expression. "We often think cruelty is loud," she said softly, "but the most lasting kind is the quiet one, the one that forgets to call, that leaves you out of the will, that stops seeing you at all." No one responded. And outside, in the rose arbor, a breeze caught the petals of a single pink bloom and scattered them across the path. For a few days, after the truth came out, St. Crispin's Lane seemed to walk on eggshells. Not literally, of course. The postman still clattered along on his bicycle, and Mrs. Weatherby still clucked about the price of sugar in the village shop. But beneath the chatter, there was a curious hollowness, as if the murder had opened a long-sealed attic in the hearts of the villagers, letting loose more than dust. Flora Templeton had not been taken away in handcuffs. That was not the way things were done in places like this, at least. Not when you were the daughter of a respected family, with a well-dressed solicitor and no clear fingerprints on anything more. Lethal than an inkwell, but she had confessed, softly and entirely, in the privacy of Inspector Cray's car. She asked for a week to arrange affairs, and was granted to days. By Tuesday morning, the gates of Lavender End were closed, the curtains drawn. A single suitcase was loaded into a waiting car with a nondescript license plate. Flora didn't say goodbye to anyone, not even Mrs. Hartley. She left behind the rose arbor in full bloom, a row of unpaid invoices in her father's study, and a letter, brief and devoid of sentiment, requesting that the orchids be donated to the Church Flower Fund. Miss Marple read it with a slight purse of the lips. "Shame," she said, setting the letter down. "Even in guilt, some people cling to propriety." Mrs. Hartley, meanwhile, returned to her work at the orphan refuge. There, she resumed her tea services and hymn scheduling with the kind of grace that can only be born of long practice in sorrow. "She's never married, you know," said Mrs. Pritchard at the market. "Always said the children were enough. But I do wonder." At the church fete the following week, postponed by mutual consent, she and Miss Marple shared a quiet moment under the sycamore tree. "I suppose I should feel vindicated," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice calm. "He was going to leave me the house, after all, and yet," asked Miss Marple. "I feel tired," the woman said, not triumphant, just tired. Miss Marple nodded. "Love does that. Even unspoken love, especially, perhaps, the villagers. For the most part, found it convenient to forget the details. They repeated the polite version that Mr. Templeton had died suddenly, that Flora had moved abroad, and that it had all been a sad misunderstanding. No one mentioned the button from the arbor, or the orchid order, or the bruised hand that told no tales. But one or two eyes lingered on the rose arbor when they passed it, and if the roses bloomed a little more fiercely that year, a redder, red, a pink more flushed, no one spoke of it. In the drawing room of her cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. She had just begun a new pattern, something involving scalloped lace edges and an unusually stubborn knot halfway down the skein as she worked it loose. She murmured softly, "People always imagine that murder is a loud affair, screams, blood, breaking glass, but it isn't. It's silence. It's what isn't said, what isn't done, what someone lets happen, because they think no one will notice." She looked up at the mantel, where a small vase of Celandines stood, a cheerful burst of yellow, in a world that still leaned toward grey. And she smiled. By the third Thursday in July, the village of Little Charnley had resumed its polite rhythm. The milk was delivered again before the sparrows had finished their chorus. The bell above the bakery door tinkled in predictable intervals, and the gardener at Lavender End clipped the hedges, as if no murder had ever wilted the grounds. But something had shifted, not shattered, no, merely rearranged. Like a familiar portrait hung just a little askew, people still smiled at one another in flames, but their glances lingered. Invitations were still sent to garden teas and bridge nights. Yet the laughter was thinner, more deliberate. It was as though everyone had been reminded that beneath the ivy and teacups lay something brittle, the human heart and its endless capabilities for secrecy. Mrs. Weatherby, who once chattered about idle nonsense while counting out boiled sweets, now paused mid-sentence as if considering the weight of her own words. Reverend Pilcher, in his Sunday homily, spoke not of hellfire, but of those hidden sorrows which, if left untended, may fester into something darker than sin. He did not mention the Templetons. He did not have to. Lavender End itself was now occupied only by Mrs. Hartley and a pair of subdued maids who made themselves scarce. The roses had begun to droop, not from neglect, but from that same subtle fatigue that seemed to have gripped the entire village. They were still beautiful, but less proud somehow, as if they knew that beauty alone had not prevented death. Miss Marple continued to walk her habitual path, basket in hand, nodding at neighbors, exchanging apple tarts for lavender sachets. She neither encouraged nor evaded the talk that followed her, for talk it did, always had, always would, about how she'd known, or guessed, or simply waited while the truth grew ripe enough to drop from its stem. Some villagers now glanced at her with new respect, others with faint unease. Not quite fear, but something adjacent, as if they suspected that no secret was safe within her line of sight. Miss Marple, for her part, made no show of satisfaction. She did not bask in the praise some were keen to offer. Instead, she made a quiet visit to Mrs. Hartley one afternoon, bringing a rhubarb tart and a book of essays by Marcus Aurelius. "It's odd," Mrs. Hartley murmured. "After tea, How a person can live among others for years, decades, and still be capable of doing something unfathomable. Miss Marple, sitting in a chair that once belonged to Mr. Templeton, replied, "I'm afraid it's not odd at all. Familiarity is not the same as understanding. We know people's habits, not their motives." Outside the window, the wind stirred. The rose arbor later, as Miss Marple returned home along the edge of the village green. She passed by a group of children playing marbles. One child, a girl with a ribbon too big for her head, looked up and asked, "Miss Marple, are you a detective?" The question was innocent, but Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "No, dear," she said gently, crouching down to inspect a perfect cat's eye marble in the girl's hand. "Just someone who's lived a very long time and paid attention." And with that, she stood, adjusted her shawl, and continued toward home, a little slower, perhaps, but with the purposeful grace of someone who understood the weight of a quiet truth in a noisy world. 2 weeks after the village began its hesitant return to routine, a curious item arrived by post at Miss Marple's cottage. Not a parcel, nor a telegram, but a simple folded letter without a return address. The handwriting was cramped and unfamiliar, and the envelope smelled faintly of ink, an old cologne. Miss Marple, having just set down a pair of darning needles and a half-finished sock, studied it with her usual blend of suspicion and detachment. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she tucked it neatly into the folds of her sewing basket beneath a neatly wound skein of rose-colored thread. It wasn't until the evening, after the last light had slipped behind the gable and the tea had gone tepid in its cup, that she read it by Lamplight. "My dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, at least not by name. But I was once deeply acquainted with someone whose recent death you have, shall we say, illuminated. I do not write to object. I rather admire what you did, though you've left the family in a rather difficult position. We Templetons, after all, have always preferred our secrets buried, not unlike our dead. What interests me, Miss Marple, is not how you solved it, but why. Most people meddle out of pride or nosiness, but you seem driven by something gentler. I wonder if it's kindness, or justice, or perhaps something darker still, a hunger for order in a world that rarely offers it. You've proven yourself formidable. That's not a compliment, simply an observation. There are other families, other arbors, other things better left untouched. Still, I suspect we shall meet one day, not in court, of course, or even in the village, but in some shaded corner where truths bloom unseen. Until then, mind the Celandines. They return every year, no matter what lies beneath. Yours reluctantly, a friend of the familiar Miss Marple. Read it twice, then once again for the feel of the thing. Not to divine the sender, she had her suspicions already, but to weigh the intent. She folded the letter back into its envelope, tied it with a piece of twine, and tucked it beneath the lining of her sewing basket once more. Outside, the Celandines had already begun to fade, their yellow petals curling like whispers. Soon the roses would reclaim the arbor, as they always did. But in the stillness of the cottage, Miss Marple sat very still, The needle paused mid-air, as though waiting to see whether the next season would bring more than flowers.